let's start the conversation by talking about the gut-brain connection and how what's happening in our gut actually impacts our brain.
Yeah, I think it's such an amazing field of research in the last 20 years. I mean, there've been a number of texts, a number of research studies done on diet, right? Just generally how diet affects the microbiome and how the microbiome regulates the production of neurochemicals like serotonin and dopamine. And that in turn affects how we think and, how we feel rewarded for our behaviors or how we feel depressed or how we might feel anxiety. And so there's no shortage of research now connecting the microbiome and the food right to our thoughts. And I think many now in the field of psychiatry and neurobiology are turning to the microbiome to say depression is actually a form of intestinal leakage, right? Or of intestinal inflammation. You can call it neural inflammation, but it starts in the gut. And I think that's where really in my wheelhouse, that's where gluten really shines and comes in because we know there's so many different ways that gluten can impact the GI tract, but even not just gluten, also grain as a whole, right? For other reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, there's a term called leaky brain. And I know that, I've talked about it in a lot of my discussions. And so, leaky brain, a lot of people have heard of leaky gut, right? That term came out, I don't know, 8, 10 years ago and became very popular in the functional medicine, natural health world. Leaky brain is kind of a new term that we're starting to understand. And it may be it's a strong indicator, a strong link between issues going on with leaky brain and mood disorders, increased neurological inflammation and neurodegeneration. So can you elaborate on that some more?
Yeah, so if we use gluten kind of as an example, one of the things that we know gluten can do just in people with gluten issues is it causes a disruption of the barrier of the cells in the GI tract, right? Leaky gut.
Mhm.
And so think of it as microscopic pinholes that are being punched in the tube of the gut lining. And what happens next is that allows for poop to leak into the bloodstream. But even more, it allows there are certain bacteria that live in our gut. And when our gut is sealed, not a big deal. These bacteria will produce byproducts. One of the byproducts that's been discovered is called lipopolysaccharide or LPS. And what happens with leaky gut is this product can basically leak into the bloodstream and it can affect the blood-brain barrier. It can actually disrupt the blood-brain barrier, opening up that barrier as well, allowing for things that shouldn't be allowed into the brain, right? And this is where some of that neurological inflammation can come in. So if you back it up, again, leaky gut allows for the progression of chemicals to leach across the gut barrier that can then in turn affect the GI tract. And then even beyond that, if going again deeper into gluten, the malnutrition that's caused by gluten for so many, the B vitamin deficiency, the mineral deficiencies, can disrupt the body's ability to repair, right? So if we're talking about the blood-brain barrier is a tissue, right? It's epithelial tissue that has a tight seal. And in order for that seal to be formed, you need B vitamins, you need nutrients. And so with that malnutrition comes an inability to repair that barrier. And with that gluten damage comes the ability for that barrier to be broken down. So when you're breaking it down, but then you're malnourished to the level that you can't rebuild it, then it becomes progressively chronic and it allows for inflammation to really set into the brain over longer periods of time. And so again, beyond depression, beyond anxiety, what are we seeing? We're seeing cognitive decline, right? If you will, dementia. Not, a lot of people think of Alzheimer's and it's a disease in the elderly, but we're seeing that much earlier. And I know you've probably seen that in clinical practice where people come in and it's not like they're forgetting their spouse's name, but they don't have the ability to walk into their kitchen and remember why they walked in there, right? And it's like, why did I come in here again? Or they go to their bedroom, why am I in here again? And that's kind of the early onset of that brain fog, early onset before it becomes full-blown dementia. It becomes, I can't remember what I was supposed to be doing here in this place, right? And so it just kind of slowly progresses over a period of time, the longer it's allowed to perpetuate.
Yeah, it's a really big issue. Cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, neurodegenerative conditions in general, huge issue, really growing. And the what's happening, the health of the gut is playing a significant role with that. Now let's go back to gluten. What is it about gluten? Because, I know there's like alpha gliadin, which is, a protein component of gluten. What is it about gluten that is contributing, that's basically causing the leaky gut? I know that gluten, for example, stimulates zonulin, this protein zonulin release. Can you go into some of those kind of more of the mechanisms behind how this is causing leaky gut and leaky brain?
Yeah, so for people with, it's important to know that for people with gluten sensitivity, so I want to be clear there because some people would argue that gluten is bad for everyone.
Hmm.
I don't know that we know that. I don't know that we have enough research and I mean, I'm the biggest advocate of a gluten-free diet probably in the world, but at the same time, I think it's important to delineate, for somebody who has gluten sensitivity, and the way I define that is genetically, if they have the genes, the positive HLA-DQ genes that predispose them to react to gluten from an immunological perspective, then now we're in trouble because what happens is gluten is a protein, and really it's not, we use the term gluten as a singular term, but really it's a plural term. We should say glutens because there's, as you mentioned a minute ago, alpha gliadin, which is a type of gluten found in wheat. And then there's like secalin found in rye, and hordein found in barley, and zein found in corn, and orzanin found in rice. There's lots of different forms of gluten. I think it was 2010. It was a group of researchers from Australia discovered it was like 400 new forms of gluten. 40 of them were more toxic than the gliadin found in wheat.
Mm.
And so we have to look at glutens as a whole, and that's why I say grain free as opposed as when I wrote my book, no grain, no pain. I didn't write no gluten, no pain, because the connotation that gluten is only found in wheat, barley, and rye is incorrect, but it is an FDA approved definition. And globally, it's the accepted kind of definition for celiac disease. But again, we want to look at the family of gluten proteins. If you have the genetics for that reaction, what that means is when you subject your body to glutens of any kind or any form, your body is more going to perceive that gluten as an enemy, the same way it would perceive a virus or a bacteria that doesn't belong as a potential threat. And it's going to create an immunological or an immune response against that gluten to try to neutralize it. And so there are many different types of immune responses. One of them, it has to do with the interaction with something called transglutaminase, which is an enzyme secreted in the small intestine. And so what happens is we get an autoimmune response against that, and then that can create damage to the lining and villus atrophy, which leads to leaky gut. There's also the connection that Fasano discovered, as you mentioned, where zonulin played a role, the disruption of the gut barrier as a result of zonulin production. And other bacteria can do that too. Gluten's not the only thing. It's not the exclusive in causing leaky gut, but it is one of the most well-researched foods or food proteins that we know can do it. So there's the autoimmune damage to the intestinal lining, which is actually celiac disease. Then there's the upregulation of zonulin, and then there's the immunological response that can lead to antibodies of other varieties that can also damage the gut. But also then there's an immune response that can lead to the production of chemicals called cytokines and interferons that can also damage the gut. And then there's now new research coming out showing that it can interact with a special receptor in the gut called a toll-like receptor, or a TLR, and that it induces inflammation through toll-like receptors. And so there's all these different mechanisms and pathways. And that's the problem, Doc, is that you get people go to their GI doctors and they get a celiac test, right? Which is really, even the celiac testing is not specific, because basically what they're doing is a biopsy of the small intestine. And the small intestine is the surface of a tennis court, right? The surface area. So it's like taking little microscopic fragments of a tennis court and saying, this is the whole tennis court. And it obviously you could have damage on one side of the court, not damage on the other. And it's the same with your intestines. So biopsies can give you a false negative as far as a diagnosis, but then you also have the blood tests that measure antibodies. One of the antibodies being only for gliadin. Well, gliadin is one type of gluten found in wheat, but then you have antibodies like transglutaminase, and it's been widely shown that many people with gluten sensitivity do not produce transglutaminase antibodies. And so if you're getting those types of tests done, and then your doctor says, oh, eat gluten all you want, you don't have celiac disease, it can be a very misleading thing. And that's, again, going back to genetic testing. If you have the genetic markers, that gives you the predisposition to react to those proteins in a negative way. And that's where it's a preventative issue, because gluten sensitivity is not a disease. It's just, in my opinion, it's a state of genetics. You either have the genes or you don't. And if you have them and you eat gluten, then your body will view it as an enemy and it will attack or try to neutralize it. And if you don't have them, not so much. Now, there are other aspects of grain beyond gluten that can cause immune responses, and that's different, right? So that's where some people, for example, when they buy bread and they react to it, and then they go over to Europe and they say, "Hey, I didn't feel as bad when I went to Europe." Well, glyphosate, which is a chemical, pesticide sprayed, double sprayed on most grains today. There's also atrazine, which is another chemical. And then there are also other components to grain, like there are families of proteins in grains called amylase trypsin inhibitors and serpinins, which can cause immune responses that have nothing to do with gluten. There's the fact that grains are a highly mold contaminated food and can contain mycotoxins, which can make people sick. So there are other aspects to grain that damage the gut lining and can cause leaky gut. Gluten is just probably the most famous.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. It's a really good rundown. So, in summary, there, celiac disease is really a late stage disease, not an early stage diagnosis. You're catching something way after, many years after it's developed in the body. And traditional medical testing when it comes to celiac and when it comes to gluten sensitivity in general is very limited because they're only looking at a certain group of antibodies for a certain group of proteins, but not getting the whole wide spectrum of gluten sensitivity. And really, to go upstream, we want to look at the genes, the HLA DQ genes, which tell you if you have that predisposition or not. And, you also talked about obviously certain enzymes like transglutaminase as well. That can really factor in there. And then that was going to be one of my questions was a lot of people will say, yeah, I can't eat wheat in America, but I go to Italy and I'm able to consume bread and I feel great. And that could be a number of different factors. Could be what's being sprayed on the wheat, could be the quality. Perhaps there's more mold and mycotoxins on the wheat that you're eating here compared to there. So there's a number of other factors, but it's not necessarily the gluten component. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So that's why I always want to say differentiate whether or not you are gluten sensitive, because if you truly are gluten sensitive, don't go eat the grain in Europe.
Mm, yeah.
Because the other thing we know about gluten sensitivity is there's a fourfold increase in risk of death if you don't change your diet, and you don't want to give yourself the false impression that you can just go over there and gorge out on pasta and bread.
Yeah, that's really good. And I mean, people definitely need to know that and understand that's a very, very serious issue.